Hey guys! So today we're going to be talking a little bit about immigration and some of the issues surrounding that, which was going on in the Gilded Age. And I want to start by looking at some graphs that kind of look at some of the changing trends in immigration. So if you look at the front of your graphic organizer, which should look a little bit like this, okay? You have the same graphs at the top of your page. So go ahead and grab that. So this first graph here just looks at the numbers of immigration. So I want you to really quickly, we're talking specifically about the period between 1871 to about 1910. So first thing I want you to do is using this graph, I want you to go ahead and answer that first question on your graphic organizer, which is how many immigrants came to the United States between those two years, 1871 and 1910. So yes, it's going to require you to do a little math here. So I suggest you go ahead and pause the video and do the math, and I'll see you back in a second. Okay, welcome back. So this was the first graph that I have you looking at here. The next graph that I want you to pay attention to looks a little bit at where some of these people were coming from. So this is immigration by home country or place of origin. So again, thinking about the period that we are talking about, and I narrowed this one a little bit more. So from the 1890s to the 1900s, I want you to figure out and write on your graphic organizer where most of the immigrants at this time were coming from. So again, I'll give you a second. Go ahead and pause and write your answer down. Okay, great. So let's look at the last one here. So this looks at the relationship between rural and urban population in the United States. So this one might be a little bit of a stranger graph, so let me just explain what's going on. So the yellow part of this graph down here looks at the percentage of population in the U.S. that lived in cities or in urban populations. The gray part looks at the percentage of the population that lived in the country or the rural parts. So just to kind of give you just a look here, if you look at 1990, just showing you how to read this graph. So if you look at 1990, it goes all the way up here. So that's about here on the graph. So that tells you that about 75% of the U.S. population in 1990 lived in cities, whereas the last 25% was a rural or a country population. So for this last question, I want you to tell me what happened to the percentage of the population that lived in cities, so the urban population, between 1800 and 1900, so in that 100-year period. So go ahead and pause it, take a look at it, and figure it out, and come back in a second. Okay, great. So now that you've got some of the basic numbers and you're kind of seeing what's been going down, let's go ahead and take a look at some of the information that you need to know. So in the United States, in terms of immigrants, we're looking at a whole kind of new wave of immigration. So the first thing that's important for you to know is what was the immigration like before 1890? And those are the terms that we call the old immigrants. So this is from the period basically when the United States got its start in the 1780s to the end of the Civil War and Reconstruction. So most of the people that are coming to the United States before 1890 are from Northern and Western Europe, okay? So we're looking at places like Britain, Germany, the Netherlands, Scandinavia. Now, think a little bit about what you know about Germans and British people and Scandinavians. Think about the language that they speak, the religion that they are. What you should be imagining in your head is somebody who doesn't probably look a whole lot different from the population of the United States in 1890. Most of the people who are coming at this time are Protestants, like most of the United States. They are, at least from Britain, they're English speakers, right? A lot of these people are able to assimilate into the U.S. pretty quickly. So remember, assimilation means that they are able to become part of American culture. They learn the language quickly. The religion is similar. Their values are similar. They're very similar to a lot of the very first immigrants. So there's not a lot of discrimination between or against these old immigrants because they're a lot like Americans, right? There's not a whole lot difference between, British people and American people in this time period. However, after 1890, there is a shift in immigration, and this is the new immigrants. So from your chart just a second ago, you should have seen that most of the people who come to the United States after 1890 are from Southern and Eastern Europe, okay? So these are going to be places like Italy, Ireland, which Ireland is technically Northern Europe, but it's a special case, so come back to that. So Italy, Ireland, a lot of those Eastern European countries like Romania, Russia, right? A lot of these people from this time period are also from Asia or Latin America. Now, compared to Southern and Eastern Europe, that population is much smaller, but there is a rise in that immigration from this period. In terms of the religion of a lot of these people, most of them are Christians, but they're Catholic, not Protestants, right? Now, Catholics in the United States were a little bit discriminated against very early in our history. So that's important for you to remember. There is also at this time period an increase in Jewish immigration, particularly Russian Jews. We'll talk more about why that is in a second. But again, the Jewish population in the United States is not very big in 1890. So right off the bat, we're getting people who are coming into the United States who are different, right? These are people who stand out. They speak a different language than what most people are used to. Culturally, they are different. You know, Jewish people are trying to keep kosher. They have certain dietary rules that they want to stick to. Their religious practices are different. Catholics have very different religious practice. There's a lot of stereotypes from about people who come from Ireland and Italy, that they are heavy drinkers and that they're lazy. And so after 1890, the immigrants that come in stand out a little bit more than those immigrants that came before 1890. And so what this is going to lead to is a little bit of tension here in the United States because of this. So the next question is why is there such an influx in immigration from these places after 1890? And there's a few reasons for that. So the first is that there had actually been a series of revolutions throughout Europe in the 1840s up through the 90s. So a lot of people are leaving their home countries in order to escape persecution or opposition. Maybe they don't like the way the government is moving, so a lot of them are leaving for that reason. A lot of them are facing religious persecution. This is particularly true in Russia. In Russia, the Tsar, the leader of Russia, began a series of what are called pogroms against Jewish people. Basically, he started evicting the Jewish people from their homes and villages. And so Jews in Russia didn't have many places to go, and a lot of them opted to immigrate to the United States. Europe is also, there's a much larger population in Europe. The population is growing. There is a shortage of land because of that. Europe is different from the US, whereas we had tons and tons of land. Think the Homestead Act, where we're just giving away free land. They don't have that in Europe. And because the population is growing, it becomes harder for people to make their own way, particularly younger couples. You know, if you're in your 20s and you've just gotten married and you don't have any way to buy or rent land, maybe you come to the United States looking for land. The gold rush also brought a lot of Europeans to the United States. There was the hope that maybe they could find gold here just as much as anybody else, particularly Asian immigration. So if you think about where the gold rush took place, it was in California, right? So there is an increase in Asian immigration during the gold rush of a lot of Chinese people who are coming to the United States at this time. And then, of course, there is also economic problem in Europe. A lot of the people in Europe don't have jobs, so they come to the United States looking for jobs, particularly to work in the factories that are developing on the East Coast or to work on building the railroads. And again, we saw this a little bit when we were talking about the West, but if you remember, who was building the Eastern Railroad? That were Chinese immigrants, remember? So this is just some of the reasons why a lot of these people are coming here. Now, the next thing is how they got here, right? So in order to get to America, the first thing you have to do is save money, which was very hard for a lot of Europeans in order to be able to get passage onto a ship to come here. If you're coming from Europe, it takes about 1 week on the steamship from the Atlantic coast. So from Europe to the United States, you would probably have to get port in Ireland or Scotland, somewhere that's more the western part of Europe. And like I said, it takes about 1 week on a ship that's run by steam. So not too terribly long of a trip. However, as we'll talk about in a second, that didn't mean that it was a great trip. If you were coming from Asia, it took about 3 weeks from China to get to the Pacific coast. So again, if you're coming from Asia, you're going to be landing in California, right? So that takes about 3 weeks. Most of the people who are coming are not wealthy. They've basically scrounged for money and saved whatever they could, and they spent every dime that they could to get here. Many of them had husbands or sons who came before them and maybe saved money and sent it back. But for the most part, these are poor people. And so really their only option is to pay for the cheapest ticket possible. And this is called steerage. So steerage is the cheapest accommodations on the ship, like I said, and these are going to be on the lowest decks of the ships. And the problem is with steerage, you don't get your own bed, you don't get, private quarters. You're basically crowded into these boats, and they're stuffing as many people as they can into these really small rooms. So if you imagine being crowded into one room, or crowded into a room with hundreds of other people for 1 week, you're eating bad food, you don't have a bathroom, right? Like, it's pretty gross conditions on these ships. So it's a pretty terrible way to actually get here. So just looking at a couple pictures here, at the bottom part, you can see these would be what maybe possible steerage accommodations would look like. If you see, these beds are tiny, tiny beds. Here's your bathroom, right, in front of everybody else that you're in steerage with. Maybe you're just crowded on the deck, so you can see that they've just crammed people in. If you look at this top picture, the steerage accommodations are these accommodations. So the only thing that's lower is the bottom of the ship where they're keeping cargo or where the steam engines are. Now, if you are wealthy, you can pay for the richer rooms where you'll have a private suite and you can, take fresh air on the top of the deck. But if you're in steerage, you don't get to do that. Right? There is a steerage deck, but again, you've got hundreds of people who are just trying to find space. A lot of people are getting seasick, right? Many people have never been sailing before. So it's a very hard voyage. Many people are coming, either men are coming alone, again, as I said, in the hopes to send money and bring their families back. So oftentimes you're going to have parents or even grandparents who are bringing their children. They don't necessarily speak the language. So you can imagine it can be a little nerve-wracking when they get here. When they arrived, depending on what coast they came from, they either went to Ellis Island or to Angel Island. So let's talk about Ellis Island first. It's the one you're probably most familiar with. So Ellis Island is in New York. It's just outside of New York City in the harbor there. These are people who are arriving from the East Coast, so people from Europe. Particularly who are coming into Ellis Island. A lot of these are going to be some of the old immigrants, but also most of them in this period are going to be those new immigrants. Approximately 17 million people came through Ellis Island from the mid 1800s to the mid 1900s, so in about a 100-year period when Ellis Island was in operation. So that's a lot of people that they're filing in and out of Ellis Island. When you arrive, the very first thing that they do is they give you a physical. If you have any sort of mental or physical condition that they do not want in this country, whether it is a disease that you might spread, or whether you are mentally unstable, or whether they suspect you are mentally unstable, if you look weak, they might send you back. You might have paid every cent that you own to get here and say, no, you're not going to stay. We're going to send you home. So it's, again, and imagine these people are crowded into this building. They don't know the language. They're being checked over by these doctors, and they don't know who they are. They don't know what they're doing. They don't know if they're going to get to stay. It's a very nerve-wracking period. The government sends people to inspect you. So you're going to get eye exams and physical exams, and You might even have to take a test to make sure that you are literate to be able to come in. You're going to have to answer questions in English about where you're from and how old you are and who you're meeting. They're not just going to let you in, especially if you are, for example, a young unmarried woman. If you're coming into the country to meet your fiance, they're going to make you leave Ellis Island married. So your fiance has to come get you at Ellis Island, and they will marry you right then and there because they don't want something untoward going on, you living with your fiance when you're not married. So it's a very hard period for people who are coming in. But compared to the people who came into Angel Island, the people at Ellis Island had it pretty good. So Angel Island is on the west coast. So mostly you're going to see the Asian immigration come in through Angel Island. And if people coming into Ellis Island were treated with suspicion, people that came into Angel Island were treated with almost disgust or disdain. They just assumed that, you were there and you were going to lie about why you were there and you were there to do something bad. So it's a smaller amount of people who come in. About 50,000 people end up coming in through Angel Island, excuse me. But while you are there, you're going to go through a series of very harsh questioning. Again, in English, you're a new immigrant from China and you don't speak English, but they're going to be basically giving you the third degree about why you're here and who you're meeting and what your plans are. And in Ellis Island, you might have to be there for a few hours, at most a few days. At Angel Island, they may keep you for a few weeks before they'll let you into the country, just to make sure you're healthy and that you are not there to cause trouble. The conditions inside Angel Island, inside the buildings, were just deplorable. They were unsanitary, unhealthy, and like I said, people might be there for weeks at a time, not knowing whether or not they're going to even get to stay in the country, whether they're believed, whether they're going to be sent back. They may be there for weeks at a time only to get sent back home. So really the treatment of immigrants was almost the way you would treat criminals as they're coming in. But we're still having thousands of people who still think that they can find a better opportunity here. So just to show you some pictures here. So this is the building at Ellis Island where you would come in, the immigration building, where you would come in and they would inspect you, and then if you passed inspection, they would send you on another ferry onto the mainland in New York. Now, I want you to compare this building to this building. So just look at even just the ornateness of this building compared to this one. This is Angel Island. You can see that even the building is not built obviously with as much care. And so the building even almost looks crooked, doesn't it? Like if you look at it right here, it almost looks like it's hanging off the hill a little bit. So the people coming into Angel Island got much of a different treatment than they did over at Ellis Island. And that's important to remember as we're going through this here. So as immigration increases, the people in America start to feel a little uncomfortable with it. And when I say a little uncomfortable, I mean a lot of uncomfortable. And this develops a new political movement called nativism. So think about that word for a second, nativism, those who are native to the United States. Now, keep in mind, this doesn't mean Native Americans. This just means people who've lived here for about 100 years, right? People who are native in the sense that my family came over at the American Revolution. My family came over before the Civil War. My family are Americans, right? So nativism is this increased anti-immigrant feeling throughout the country, right? And it runs pretty rampant throughout most of the country. There's a lot of discrimination against people who are different, whether it's different because of their religion. So think if you're Catholic, like I said, there's a lot of discrimination against Catholics. Most of the people who are coming in from, Italy are Catholic. The Irish are Catholic. In Eastern Europe, they're Eastern Orthodox. So they're not Catholic, but they're not Protestants either. So they're different, right? They're Jewish. They're different. They're Asians. They don't look like us. They're different. And so this really increases this attitude of, we don't want you here. They thought, first of all, they're taking jobs that we would want. This is kind of an age-old rhyme. We hear this today, like, we don't want immigrants because they're taking our jobs, right? Keep in mind that a lot of the jobs that immigrants were taking were jobs that nobody else wanted. Think about like the Asians working on the railroad. from the east or the Irishmen working on the railroad from the west, most Americans weren't taking those jobs, right? Working at factories for little to no pay. There wasn't actually a lot of job competition that was going on. This increases throughout the country. The Chinese Exclusion Act is passed, and this is passed after the railroad is completed, right? So remember, we were importing people from China to build the railroad because we thought that, they could build the wall, they can build the railroad, right? Well, once the railroad is done, we don't want any more Chinese people into our country. So they actually outlaw immigration from China for 10 years. They're saying we're not going to let anybody else from China into our country for 10 years. This act is actually continually renewed until World War II. That's 1940, right? So almost for 50 years in this country, we said we won't let anybody in from China, right? We put a quota on that. No Chinese people. We also make an agreement with Japan. We call it the Gentleman's Agreement. This is actually after Japan had just fought a war with Russia, and Teddy Roosevelt, the president, goes to Japan to kind of help settle the treaty. And while he's there, he makes this unofficial agreement with the Chinese or with the Japanese government. Okay, so this is not a law, this is not a treaty, it's just an agreement between the leaders of the Americans and the leaders of the Japanese. And again, they're trying to restrict immigration from Asia. So they said, Japan says, all right, we won't let Japanese people leave to go to the United States, especially unskilled workers. We might let like teachers or other scholars or people who are skilled, they can go, but we're going to keep unskilled people from going. You're poor people, basically. And in return, the U.S. would end their discrimination policy in public schools, where Japanese Americans were not allowed to attend the same schools as white Americans were. So this was segregation in the schools between Japanese and white students. And the United States says, we'll stop doing that if you limit the people leaving your country to come to our country. So U.S. begins to allow the schools to desegregate for Japanese Americans because of this. So it's just another example of how people who were different, in the sense that Asians, were not wanted in our country at this time. But there was this argument throughout this period that the United States is becoming what we call a melting pot, all right? So there's a Schoolhouse Rock song. I don't know if you've ever seen it. Schoolhouse Rock might be a little old school for you, but there's a song about the melting pot where it's a lovely lady Liberty with her book of recipes, and the finest one she's got, the great American melting pot. Okay, so the idea behind the melting pot is that all of these different cultures and languages and people are coming together to form one great big American culture. That's a great idea, right? Well, the problem is that we were actually trying to get a lot of people to, rather than become part of our culture, we wanted them to assimilate, right? So rather than adopting their ideas, we want them to adopt our ideas. Now, there was a push for this kind of like preserving the culture of where you came from. And part of the result of that are what we call ethnic islands. And we'll talk about that in just a second. So ethnic islands are not islands, like not out in the middle of the ocean. It's not like we took all of the Italian people and stuck them on an island in the middle of New York Harbor. But ethnic islands are communities, are neighborhoods where people from specific places ended up living together, communities of people who are from the same place, right? So if you've ever been to a big city, almost every big city in this country has a Chinatown. And the way Chinatown came to be is because when Chinese immigrants were coming in, they were attracted to each other, right? It's a familiar culture, familiar food, familiar language. People who are of the same culture wanted to live near each other. So Chinatown or Little Italy, all these places develop because the immigrants are moving together, right? So that's why if you go to New York, you go to the Chinese part of New York or the Italian part of New York or the Jewish neighborhoods in New York. And those formed because all of these immigrants were wanting to stay with people of a similar community, okay? So just a couple photographs here. The Irish in particular in the East Coast had a hard time with discrimination. Irish people had a reputation for being drunkards and lazy. Not true, right? But nobody wanted to hire them. So Irish people come here, escaping famine, escaping English oppression. They think they're going to be able to, join this American community. But as you'll see, a lot of people didn't even want to hire them. So you look at this picture right here. This is a sign that was put in a store window, help wanted, but no Irish need apply. We'll hire anybody but Irish people. These are advertisements in the paper where you can see up here, they're looking for a maid and a nanny, right? Wanted, a girl of neat and industrious habits and an amiable disposition. So a girl that's neat and hardworking and sweet. Amiable means sweet or friendly. Amiable disposition, to take the entire charge of 2 small children, to be our nanny, right? No Irish need apply. Notice to contractors, the whitewashing and papering of Hackett's and Keefe's saloon will be given to the lowest bidder. Bids in the sealed proposal and not to exceed $13, the balance in whiskey. So basically they're looking for somebody to redecorate their saloon, right? We'll charge you, we'll pay up to $13, anything else we'll give you in whiskey. No Irish need apply. Down here, grocery cart and harness for sale, in good order. 1 chestnut horse, 8 years old. An excellent saddle horse, can be ridden by a lady. Also, one young man wanted from 16 to 13 years of age, able to ride. Right. No Irish need apply. Right? They're looking for somebody to work at their house. No Irish need apply. Right? So this is just some example of this nativism where people are not wanting to deal with people who are different, who have a reputation for being different. And this becomes a really big issue. But I want you to take a look at this political cartoon here. So this political cartoon is called Looking Backwards, okay? I want you to pay careful attention to see what's going on. So I'm just going to describe it to you. We're actually going to talk about it in class, but I want you to just get a good look of it, take it in. So right here, you've got these 5 men. Look how they're dressed. What are they doing, right? This guy's holding up his hands to him over here. Imagine who these men might be. Think about what we've just talked about. So we've got this guy right here. He looks like he's coming off the harbor of a ship. He's got, his bag on his back, in his hand, probably an immigrant, right? So compare him to the shadows of these men. Think about what those shadows are saying about these men, where they came from. This idea of looking backwards, right? So remember this political cartoon. Like I said, we're going to talk about it, discuss it a little bit more in class, but I want you to just take that in for a little bit here. I want to end today. You'll notice this one was a little less quirky, but I want to end today with the poem that is inscribed onto the Statue of Liberty. So the Statue of Liberty was given to the United States as a gift from France. They had a man design it in France, a French sculptor who designed it, and they sent it in pieces to the United States. We reassembled it and put it in New York Harbor. They wanted to get a poem written in order to represent what the Statue of Liberty was all about. And a woman named Emma Lazarus wrote a poem called The New Colossus. So we're gonna look at that. I'm gonna read that poem to you right here. Not like the brazen giant of Greek fame, with conquering limbs astride from land to land. Here our sea-washed sunset gates shall stand, a mighty woman with a torch whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name, Mother of Exiles. From her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome. Her mild eyes command the air-bridged harbor the twin cities frame. Keep ancient lands your storied pomp, she cries with silent lips. Give me your poor, your tired, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door.